Welcome to another section of the Worship Planning Toolbox for Lay Leaders video series. Now, you may wonder why I've waited so long to talk about this session, which is hymn selection. After all, that is where the rubber meets the road in worship planning, isn't it? Partly it's because I was busy, to be honest. Partly because I had to figure out how to map out the discussion. I've decided to treat relatively traditional hymns and hymn sources in this presentation, and that means I'm going to ask you to break out your LBW, ELW, or LSB today. I plan to address the selection of contemporary hymnody in an upcoming video. That presents some unique challenges and opportunities, although I will think that at least some of what we discussed today is going to tie in with the next installment. And there's another reason for the long wait, really the main reason. Hymn selection will be easier, more intentional, and more helpful to forming folks into better worshipers of the triune God once you've absorbed and digested the previous sessions on topics like the flow and shape of the liturgy, the church year, and the lectionary. Now we're going to get into some of the nuts and bolts. But having all that other stuff in your mind and in your planning toolkit will enable you to use the resources, map out a season's worth of hymns, teach less familiar hymns, and in general navigate the hymn selection part of worship planning with less drama. And that leads to our first question. Why is it so hard to pick out hymns and to do so without getting yelled at for your choices? Well, here are some reasons. First, most people are not familiar with a lot of hymns, and yeah, this includes pastors. They have some favorites, of course, and there's a somewhat larger number of hymns that they sort of know. Next, most people don't read music, and they're not always confident singers. This includes pastors, although heaven knows some of us are guilty of kind of leading at top volume. So there's a few, differences there. But most people pick up things by ear. They listen and then they tentatively sing along with the stronger singers. If they really like a tune, eventually learning by ear morphs into singing by heart. Next, most people don't know how to match hymns with scriptures or the themes of the day or the season. Now, pastors may be better at this, but if they're oblivious, for example, to the unfamiliarity of a tune, well, then the good theology in a hymn will probably be wasted. People will shut their hymnals, ears, and minds to the words if they don't like and can't learn by ear an unfamiliar tune. Most people also don't know what resources are available to help them, whether in the hymnal or elsewhere. And I think this includes pastors. I mean, are you sensing a theme? And finally, most people don't want to get picked on when they choose an unpopular or unfamiliar hymn. Rinse and repeat. This includes pastors. Sadly, a lot of worship wars feature, "I hate those stupid hymns they're inflicting on us," as one of the major battles. And it's not just contemporary versus traditional either. Well, fortunately, there is some help. That's why we're here today. What are some of the tools at your disposal as you plan the hymns for worship? Well, first of all, hymns have excellent and often underutilized resources available right in the hymnal for hymn selection. In the front of our major hymnals, LBW, ELW, and LSB, each one of them features a 3-year lectionary cycle of readings. Now, this alone will help you choose hymns based on the important themes in one or more of the appointed lessons. You might want to review the session on lectionaries as a refresher. Now, a major note, the LBW lectionary is outdated. It represents the first go at a 3-year lectionary, and it's almost 50 years old now. It's been superseded by the revised Common Lectionary, which you see in ELW, and in the LSB, Lutheran Service Book of the Missouri Synod, and the Sola Publishing variant thereof. Now, you can still use the old LBW lectionary if you want, but there aren't going to be any supporting resources available anymore. And I don't even follow it when I compile my hymn suggestions. I am already using the two lectionaries that are most commonly used in most Lutheran churches. Next, yes, you can certainly just rely on bulletin inserts that you might be getting from one of the publishing houses. But if they're not immediately handy and you want to work on something and plan ahead, you actually can still do that. So let's start by taking a look at the lectionary in the front of a hymnal. Now, for ease of, trying to do everything, because I'm pretty primitive and don't have things behind me, and I'm not really able to put things up on the screen for you, we're going to just use, for this example, ELW. All right? So you go to the lectionary in the front of ELW. It starts on page 37. The readings for each Sunday in all three cycles, cycle A is Matthew, B is Mark, C is Luke, they're all laid out. For Advent 1 through Holy Trinity Sunday, it's really pretty straightforward to follow. But because the date of Easter causes the Pentecost season to shrink or expand, things can get a tad tricky in that long green season. So, for the season after Pentecost, you generally find the readings based on 1 week calendar windows. Now, here's a quick note. If the first few Pentecost season offerings that they show are actually for dates that come before Holy Trinity in the year that you're in and looking at, ignore them. Use the readings, for that date for the appropriate Easter season Sunday or for Pentecost or Trinity Sunday. However, if the date window that you're looking at is after Holy Trinity, pick up with the proper week window. Now, don't worry, there are prompts embedded in this resource in the front of the hymnal to help you navigate. For example, turn to page 39 in ELW. Look at the week window for Sunday, June 12th through 18th. Now, in parentheses, it adds, if after Holy Trinity. Remember, I just said, it could be that Easter was really late the year that you happen to look at that resource date. And so maybe it needs to be done in a different way. But then after that, it says time after Pentecost, lectionary 11. Now, sadly, in the ELW calendar, you don't count a Sunday as being the, Xth Sunday after Pentecost, the 5th or the 9th or whatever. It's simply designated as, in this case, lectionary 11. Honestly, I don't know why they did that. Just accept it as a complicating mystery of life. All right, now let's switch gears to examine life in the other major lectionary. If you use the Sola calendar and its resources or the Lutheran Service Book, well, the Lutheran Service Book lectionaries begin on page XIV in the front. By the way, LSB also has a 1-year lectionary, which I'm going to ignore for now. I think you can probably figure out how to use it pretty easily if you choose. The LSB designation for those Sundays after Pentecost are by what's called proper numbers and also by week window. The Sola calendar, which is based on that LSB 3-year lectionary, uses the terminology Sundays after Pentecost and the proper designations. And because they don't have a perpetual calendar in Sola, you actually just get the specific date on the calendar for each specific year of calendar that you order or download. Just remember, ordinary and proper time actually starts back in the Epiphany green season and then resumes in that green season that occurs after Pentecost. I know. Just bear with me. When I send out hymn suggestions, I try to hit every terminology iteration you might regularly encounter. This is probably the most complicated thing you're going to have to navigate. It really isn't too bad once you get into it, especially since you're probably going to be using only one hymnal most of the time and one lectionary as your primary resource. Well, moving on. At the rear of all our Lutheran hymnals are several useful indexes. Now, here's a quickie. The LBW actually has a section for possible hymn of the day selections for every Sunday in the church year for all 3 cycles. It's really handy. If you're using their lectionary, it's great, but if you're not, check whether the readings are what you would be using. Remember that note I made about the LBW lectionary being outdated by now. Sadly, the ELW and LSB don't feature this hymn of the day suggestion, but there is a wonderful resource. It's a spiral-bound treasure called the Lutheran Service Book Hymn Selection Guide. I use it all the time. And it features a hymn of the day choice, and that can be really, really helpful. There's also in the back of the hymnals a topical index. Now, major topics will often have a section of their own in the hymnal proper, where you find the hymns themselves. There's, a section on witness, and you'll find a dozen or so hymns right there. Hope, forgiveness, stuff like that. And so you're going to see an index heading for those topics as well, but they'll have some additional hymns that might fit in one of those, but could also be included in some other topic as well. Additionally, there are topics that you'll see in this index like commissioning, cities, inner life, and the like. Now, as I say, obviously some hymns are going to fit in several slots. So you might find some hymns appearing, in different sections of this topical index. But if you glance at your readings for the day, you're going to see keywords or themes. If you check this topical index, you can get help finding hymns that touch on those themes in one or more of the lessons. Now, here's a really cool one. There is a tune name index. For example, consider the hymn, The Church's One Foundation. In LBW, that's hymn 369. In ELW, it's 654. In LSB, it's 644. Go ahead and switch, and find 369, 654, or 644. Now, at the end of the hymn, on the bottom of the page, or at the end of the hymn if it goes into a second page, you're going to see on the bottom left who wrote the music and who wrote the text. That is, the composer and the lyricist. On the bottom right is the hymn tune name, in this case, Aurelia. And you'll find also its meter. It'll say 7676D. That is going to be a handy piece of information. We're going to get to that in a minute. And it basically refers to how many syllables there are in how many lines in this hymn. This is really helpful. So, go now to the back of the hymnal to that index that I mentioned, tune names. It's also called tunes, alphabetical, or alphabetical index of tunes, depending on which hymnal you're using. Look up Aurelia. You're going to discover it's used for another hymn. Now, that means that even if you thought your congregation didn't know, for example, LBW number 197, O Living Bread from Heaven, they know the tune. It's Aurelia. So it's an easy one to introduce if, by chance, your congregation hadn't tried it yet. There's another index, and it's great. I didn't check what it's called in the Lutheran Service Book, but in LBW, it's called tunes metrical. In ELW, the index name is Metrical Index of Tunes. Duh. Remember, most hymns are like poems set to music, and most poems have a particular meter. All right, flip back, keep your finger in a couple of places. Turn back to The Church's One Foundation. Under the name Aurelia is the meter 7676D, as in dog. That means there's a line of 7 syllables, followed by one of 6, then 7, then 6, and then that whole thing is repeated or doubled, hence the D. All right, go to the back of your hymnal. Turn to the metrical index of tunes, and you'll see they're in order. Find 7676D. There are a lot of them, all with different tune names. If you looked them all up, you'd find some familiar ones and a bunch of tunes. So let's say you looked up one, Kuortane. It's a Finnish tune. Although it's fairly simple, and in fact it's used, as you could see, for several different hymns, possibly nobody at your church knows it, and you might not have a strong vocal leader. But it's one of the hymns that uses this tune, Kuortane, is a paraphrase of the Song of Solomon. Lord, now you let your servant, it's called. And the Song of Simeon is where Simeon blesses Mary and baby Jesus in the temple. That may fit the reading for the day. So what do? Nobody knows this hymn tune. Well, the tune for the Church's One Foundation, Aurelia, has the same meter. Try singing it to that and see if it works. Hint. Some tunes will not be good matches for some words. You gotta hum or sing it out loud first before you suggest a substitution. Now, there are many popular metrical schemes, and each of them has at least a few hymn tunes you know well. There's common meter, that's 8686, or common meter doubled, that'll have a D after it. There's long meter, 8888. There's short meter, I think that's 6686. And so you're going to find that a lot of hymns follow one of those really popular schemes. So there's a bunch of tunes out there, and you might be able to find one that will substitute if you pick out a hymn and nobody seems to know the tune. When in doubt, try a simple swap. Just alert your musicians ahead of time. Also, maybe your secretary who has to type up the bulletin. In fact, this swap the tune stuff is really a good thing about which to collaborate with your musician. First of all, he or she can play through a likely tune, and they may have a good idea of which are the most singable for your parishioners. Finally, there's a first line of a hymn index. That's very helpful, and I think that's for pretty obvious reasons. Now, there are a couple of other indexes, but unless you're planning a service with nothing but hymns by Nikolai Grundtvig or from the early American Sacred Harp resource, you can safely skip them for now. Oh, one more thing. You can go online and search for appropriate hymns based on texts or on the Sunday of the church year. Now, the problem is you might get suggestions for hymns that don't appear in our Lutheran hymnals. That can slow you down a little bit. Or you could obtain my for free hymn suggestions either by accessing them on the Lutheran Core Worship resource page or by getting them directly from me. All right, now you got a few navigation and selection tools under your belt. But what if you find a great hymn that just isn't familiar, especially if you can't easily swap melodies? Well, introducing familiar hymns does not need to be as painful or dramatic as we sometimes dread. In fact, you can tackle it in a fairly orderly fashion with a little help from your friends. First, as I described in the previous section, sometimes you actually can introduce a hymn whose words are powerful, faithful to the scriptures of the day, by substituting a more familiar hymn tune. As I also said, just be careful. A bright, bouncy tune might be an awkward match for a meditative prayer text or vice versa. And watch out for tunes that, even though the meter is right and the tune is familiar, end up putting the accent on, shall we say, the penultimate syllable. Everything will sound dorky. Just try singing "Praise God from whom all blessings flow" to the tune for "Children of the Heavenly Father," or vice versa. Second, if you're not sure what the congregation knows, as I said earlier, talk to your musician. He or she probably has some notations of what hymn was sung when and what hasn't been sung. Also, either ask the musician or someone who happily sings hymns and knows a lot to sit down and go through the hymnal with you. Take your time. Go through maybe a couple of dozen hymns at a time, and maybe use a different color highlighter to indicate what hymns in, say, the Advent or the Holy Communion sections are familiar, which ones have been sung but are less familiar, and which ones are unfamiliar. That can give you a good baseline for what you're going to do. Another thing you can do is use the sandwich method of hymn selection, especially if you're introducing an unfamiliar tune. The opening and closing hymns might therefore be good bread and butter hymns, familiar, really singable. Now, certainly try to be sensitive to the season or the theme of the day, something that's going on maybe in the Old Testament reading. But when in doubt, if you're introducing one hymn that's unfamiliar, and that'll probably be the hymn of the day, go for something truly familiar, something that's truly in the congregational comfort zone for all the other hymns. As I've just mentioned, the hymn of the day, that's generally going to reflect the gospel, some obvious theme of the day, or, whatever scripture the pastor or preacher is going to be focusing on. It may even reflect something, if you're doing a sermon series, that has nothing to do with the lectionary itself, but rather will follow some other theme. But my deal with congregations is that they should expect the real theological meat, even if the tune may not be as familiar, in the hymn of the day, because that's supposed to really help them reflect on the gospel and or the sermon. And then I will make sure they sing something like, "I love to tell the story, how great thou art," or "On eagle's wings," at the beginning and at the end. Another thing is, I've always liked introducing unfamiliar hymns through the Hymn of the Month Club method. Like I said at the beginning of this presentation, many people are not sight readers. They learn by ear. And they're not confident. But if they hear a tune for several weeks in a row, they do start picking it up by ear. So maybe the first week, I'll have the musician use it as the prelude, and also have folks sing it as the hymn of the day. I may not use all the verses if it's really long, and you'll see why in a second. The next week, we'll sing 2 to 3 verses, maybe the opening verse and whatever we didn't sing the week before, as the opening hymn. On the third week, if it's appropriate, you can use a couple of verses as the hymn of praise, as the closer during communion. At any rate, by the end of the month, even if folks end up hating the hymn, they'll admit they were given a fair shot at learning it. As a side note, some older hymns in particular can be found on the excellent online resource, hymnary, hymnary.org. That resource will also often give you some interesting tidbits about the hymn tune or the words that may make a hymn more accessible. For example, I always like using "Before You, Lord, We Bow" close to Independence Day. And I tell people it's really kind of cool because it was written by Francis Scott Key himself. Similarly, Now Thank We All Our God was written by a Lutheran pastor who buried most of his village, including his own wife, during the 30 Years' War. Abide With Me was written by someone who knew he was dying. Amazing Grace was penned by a former slave trader. All Glory, Laud, and Honor was written by a monk who was imprisoned at the time. When you can find little tidbits like that, and especially for hymns that aren't as familiar as the ones I just mentioned, it can personalize the hymns for people. They can take more interest and care in learning it. And plus, they learn a few cool things. A few other things to keep in mind about hymn selection. Remember that there's a flow and a structure to the liturgy. So you might not want On Our Way Rejoicing as the opening hymn, for example. If there's no communion, go easy on communion-themed hymns, but don't omit them entirely if the text deals with, say, manna in the wilderness or some kind of God graciously feeding his people narrative. I sometimes like to tweak a congregation that sits for the hymn of the day by having them sing stand up for Jesus. But that's me. And yeah, I do encourage them to stand up. Also, keep in mind who's up front on a given Sunday. Don't introduce a new hymn when you've got a substitute organist and a guest preacher who can't carry a tune. In fact, make sure you run the hymns, especially the hymn of the day, by the preacher. Based on the theme of the sermon, he or she might have a more appropriate hymn to suggest. If the congregation knows it, use it. If not, collaborate to find one that is satisfactory. Finally, remember to honor the piety and the loves of your congregation. You may not personally care for Onward Christian Soldiers, In the Garden, or some other favorite, but a lot of folks do. Please, don't roll your eyes and sneer at them. Don't relegate those hymns to one Sunday hymn sing a year. If they fit one of the scriptures, the season, or the day of the year, or some other significant event being recognized, use them honestly, freely, and unironically. Your people will love you for it. They'll be more likely to forgive an awkward selection. And you might find yourself unexpectedly tearing up when you see folks shut their hymnal, close their eyes, and sing that old hymn not by ear, but by heart. Next time, we'll be talking about the challenges that contemporary worship and contemporary hymnody can pose when you're trying to select hymns, and some suggestions for how to tackle that. Until then, to God alone be the glory. Bye-bye.